The taste came first. Copper and ash and something else, something that had no name in any language humans were meant to speak. It coated my tongue like oil, thick and viscous, and no amount of water could wash it away. That was 3 years ago, though time has become uncertain for me, the way shadows become uncertain in flickering candlelight. I was, Lexicanum apprentice, Hadrian Voss of the Scholastica Sicana, trained to wield the Emperor's light against the darkness, prepared through decades of conditioning to resist the whispers from beyond. I survived what no one survives. I endured possession by a creature from the warp, felt it inhabit my flesh, wear my body like a stolen coat, and I lived through the exorcism that tore it from me. This is not a blessing, this is not the Emperor's mercy. This is something else entirely, and I spend every waking moment, and there are so many waking moments now, sleep having become a country I can no longer visit, trying to understand what I have become in the aftermath. Before it happened, I was unremarkable in the way that all psychers are unremarkable once you've seen enough of us. Sanctioned at 14 after manifesting abilities that would have gotten me burned on a more primitive world, trained at the primary facility on a world whose name I was required to forget upon graduation, assigned to archival duties because my particular gifts, minor precognition, surface-level telepathy, the ability to sense warp disturbances at close range, made me useful for cataloging forbidden texts without being powerful enough to warrant frontline deployment. I was safe. Boring. I spent my days in climate-controlled archives, wearing the grey robes of my station, touching ancient documents with gloved hands, recording their contents into cogitators that hummed with machine spirits content in their servitude. The most dangerous thing I encountered in those days was paper dust, and the occasional corrupted data slate that tried to display things that weren't meant for human eyes. The facility was located beneath the surface of a shrine world, built into bedrock that had been consecrated by saints whose bones formed part of the foundation. 13 levels of archives, meditation chambers, testing rooms, and detention cells for psychers who'd begun exhibiting instability. I worked on level 7 in the Apocrypha sector, where we stored texts too dangerous to destroy but too valuable to abandon. Heretical treatises that contained actual useful information about warp entities. Grimoires seized from chaos cults that detailed summoning methodologies we needed to understand to prevent. Journals kept by fallen psychers documenting their descent, studied so we might recognize the warning signs in ourselves. It was important work, necessary work, and it was killing me slowly, the way reading poison letters might kill you, not through the words themselves, but through the accumulated toxicity of prolonged exposure. I noticed the taste 3 months before the possession. Faint at first, barely present, just an odd flavor that appeared when I woke and faded by mid-morning. I mentioned it during my monthly psychological evaluation, a routine interview conducted by interrogator Valence, a woman whose augmetic eyes could supposedly detect lies through micro-expressions I couldn't consciously control. She made a notation, asked follow-up questions about my dreams, my meditation practices, whether I'd experienced any unusual psychic phenomena. I answered honestly. My dreams were normal, forgettable fragments involving childhood memories and anxieties about work performance. My meditations remained clear. My psychic sense detected nothing abnormal. Valence marked me as stable, approved me for continued duty, and I returned to level 7 feeling vaguely embarrassed for wasting her time with what was probably just a dietary issue or minor illness. The taste intensified gradually over the following weeks. Copper and ash and that nameless other component, present every morning, lasting longer each day, becoming so pronounced that food began tasting wrong, like everything I ate had been cooked in tainted oil. I submitted a medical request, was examined by a facility medic who found nothing wrong with my tongue, my throat, my digestive system. Blood tests came back normal, genetic markers showed no deviation from my baseline. The medic suggested psychosomatic causes stress manifesting as phantom taste, my subconscious processing something my conscious mind hadn't recognized. He prescribed mild sedatives and recommended reduced archive exposure, perhaps reassignment to clerical duties that didn't involve handling corrupted materials. I didn't take the sedatives, didn't request reassignment, because by then I'd begun to suspect what the taste meant, what it signified, and admitting that suspicion meant admitting vulnerability, meant opening myself to scrutiny that could end my career or my life, depending on what the investigators found. The taste was a warning. Something had touched me. Not physically, not in any way the Medicae's instruments could measure, but in the realm of consciousness, in that space where psychers exist partially outside normal reality. Something had brushed against my mind during one of my archive sessions, during some moment when I'd been reading a corrupted text or cataloguing a grimoire, and it had left a mark, a taint, a foothold. I should have reported it immediately. That's what our training emphasized, what every lesson hammered into us with religious fervor. The moment you suspect corruption, the moment you feel anything unusual, you report it and submit to examination and accept whatever judgment the Inquisition deems appropriate. Better to die pure than live tainted. Better to burn than to become a gateway for horrors that could consume worlds. I knew this. Believed it, even. But I was also 27 years old, had spent 13 years in training and service, and the thought of ending my life because of a taste I couldn't explain, couldn't prove was anything more than imagination or illness, felt like cowardice, like giving up. So I said nothing, continued working, tried to ignore the copper ash nameless flavor that now persisted from waking to sleep, that colored every breath, every word I spoke. The possession occurred on a day that had been entirely ordinary until it wasn't. I was cataloguing a collection of documents seized from a chaos cult on the Eastern Fringe, texts written in Imperial Gothic but containing linguistic structures that twisted the language into something that hurt to read. Not physically, there was no pain, but conceptually, as if the words themselves were wrong, as if they violated some fundamental rule of how meaning should be constructed. I'd been working with these texts for 3 days, processing perhaps 50 pages per day, using established protocols, read only with psychic wards active, document in summary rather than direct transcription, incinerate after cataloguing. Standard procedure, safe procedure. Except on the 3rd day, on page 147 of a manuscript titled The 17 Joys of Dissolution, something in the text recognized me. I felt it like a hand closing around my consciousness. Not gentle, not gradual, just immediate crushing pressure, as if some vast weight had descended on my mind from a direction that shouldn't exist. The taste exploded across my senses, copper ash nameless multiplied 1,000-fold, so intense I could smell it, could feel it coating my skin, could see it as a haze distorting my vision. I tried to scream, managed only a sound like air escaping from a punctured lung, tried to activate the emergency alarm built into my desk, found my hand wouldn't obey, found my body moving without my permission, standing, turning, walking toward the archive's exit with purpose I hadn't authorized. It felt like being a passenger, like watching myself from behind glass, able to see everything, feel everything, but unable to control anything. My body moved smoothly, naturally, betraying no sign that its operator had changed. It walked through the archive's security checkpoint, past servitors that scanned for weapons and contraband, but not for the thing wearing me. Rode the lift to level 3, where residential quarters housed psychers during rest cycles. Entered my assigned chamber, locked the door, and then stood in the center of the room, perfectly still, for what might have been hours or minutes time had become strange, elastic, simultaneously too fast and too slow. Then it spoke. Not aloud, though I felt my vocal cords vibrate. Not in Gothic, though I understood perfectly. It spoke in the language of concepts, of meanings that bypassed words entirely, and what it said was, "Thank you for the invitation, little light. This flesh is adequate. These protections are insufficient. The work begins now." I hadn't invited anything, hadn't opened myself willingly to possession, but it believed I had, insisted I had, and I couldn't argue because somewhere in those 3 days of reading, in those 147 pages of corrupted text, I'd done something, looked at something, thought something, understood something that constituted invitation in whatever rules governed these transactions. My consent hadn't been conscious, but it had been real, at least real enough for the entity to use it as justification, as permission, as the key that unlocked my defenses and allowed it entry. What followed was 3 days of imprisonment in my own body. 3 days of watching it use my hands, my voice, my face, to accomplish goals I couldn't fully comprehend. It attended my work shifts, catalogued documents with perfect competency, responded appropriately to colleagues' greetings and questions. It was better at being me than I had been. More confident, more articulate. It knew things I knew but had forgotten, accessed memories I'd buried, performed my duties with an efficiency that made me seem, from outside, like I was having an exceptionally productive week. No one suspected. Not Interrogator Valance during a chance encounter in the corridor. Not my fellow Lexicanum apprentices during communal prayers. Not the servitors and security systems designed to detect psychic anomalies. The entity wore me perfectly, and I screamed silently behind eyes that no longer belonged to me, witnessing my own life continue without my participation. At night, when the facility's lights dimmed to simulate circadian rhythms that helped psychers maintain sanity, the entity did things I still don't fully understand. It would stand before my chamber's mirror and make my face do things faces shouldn't do, smile too wide, eyes tracking in opposite directions, skin rippling, as if something beneath was trying different configurations. It was practicing, learning the limits of human expression, the range of emotions this stolen body could display, and it would speak to me, or directing thoughts into my imprisoned consciousness with casual cruelty. It told me about the warp, about what existed in that realm of raw emotion and impossible physics, described it not as hell or heaven but as a place, a landscape composed of feelings and beliefs, and the psychic residue of every thought humanity had ever produced. Told me I was wrong about everything, that the Emperor wasn't a god, that the warp entities we called daemons weren't evil in any meaningful sense, just different, operating according to rules that human morality couldn't encompass. It told me these things not to convert me, but because my horror amused it, because watching my certainties crumble provided entertainment during the hours when there was nothing else to do. On the third night, it attempted to open a gateway. That's what it had been building toward, the purpose behind maintaining my cover, continuing my work routine. It needed time to prepare, to gather psychic energy from the facility's ambient background, from the hundreds of psychers housed here whose power leaked constantly despite their training. It stood in my chamber, drew symbols on the floor using my blood extracted by cutting my palm with a blade I didn't know I possessed, and began a ritual that made the air taste like the inside of my mouth had tasted for months, made reality thin until I could see through it to something else, somewhere else. A place of colors that weren't colors and geometries that violated every law of physics I'd learned. The ritual failed. Not because of my resistance, I had none, was a passenger without steering capacity, but because Interrogator Valance had been more suspicious than she'd appeared, had been monitoring me since that first mention of unusual taste, watching through the facility's surveillance systems, tracking my movements, my behavior, waiting for confirmation before acting. She burst into my chamber with a strike team of Templars-sanctioned warriors whose faith burned bright enough to wound warp entities even in real space at the exact moment the gateway began opening. What followed was violence I remember only in fragments, in sensory flashes that my consciousness couldn't fully process. The entity fought, used my psychic abilities with expertise I'd never achieved, threw power I didn't know I possessed at enemies who met it with fire and faith and weapons designed to kill things that shouldn't exist. My body took damage, burns, broken bones, trauma that should have been fatal, but the entity kept it moving, kept it fighting, until the Templars managed to force it back, managed to weaken its hold long enough for the facility's primary psyker, a man whose name I never learned, to perform an exorcism. The exorcism was worse than the possession. The possession had at least been clean, one entity replacing another, my consciousness shoved aside but not destroyed. The exorcism was ripping, was tearing, was the entity being forcibly extracted from tissues it had begun integrating with, from neurons it had been rewiring, from a soul it had started to understand. I felt everything. The entity screamed through my mouth, with my voice, but it wasn't me screaming, was the thing wearing me, expressing emotions I couldn't name, and then it was gone. Pulled out, cast back to whatever realm had spawned it. And I was alone in my body, truly alone for the first time in 3 days, and the absence felt worse than the presence had. They kept me unconscious for 6 weeks after the exorcism. Medically induced coma while my body healed from trauma that should have been fatal, that would have been fatal for anyone without access to the facility's advanced Medicaid capabilities and sanctioned regenerative rituals. When I woke, I was in a detention cell, comfortable enough, with a bed and basic amenities, but absolutely a cell, with reinforced walls and psychic dampening fields and observation equipment monitoring my every movement. Interrogator Valence visited daily, asked questions I could barely answer because my memory of the possession was fragmentary, because the entity's thoughts had mixed with mine in ways I couldn't fully separate. She was patient, professional, recorded everything, made clear that my fate depended entirely on whether the Inquisition believed I could be salvaged, whether I retained enough sanity and loyalty to remain useful rather than requiring immediate execution as a contaminated liability. The taste remained. Copper and ash, and that nameless other component, still coating every breath, every word. But now I understood what it signified, what it had always signified. The entity had left a mark. Not the entity itself that had been exorcised, but the space it had occupied, the shape it had carved into my consciousness, remained. Like a scar, like a hollow, like an absence that retained the outline of what had filled it. The facility's psychers examined me repeatedly, checking for any trace of lingering possession, finding nothing except that hollow space, that scar, that wrongness in the architecture of my soul. Clean, they said. Corrupted, they meant. But clean in the sense that no foreign entity currently inhabited me, no immediate threat existed. Just damage, permanent, fundamental damage to the structures that made me a functional psyker. They released me from detention after 4 months. Not to freedom, I would never be free again in any meaningful sense, but to modified duty. I couldn't return to archival work, couldn't be trusted around corrupted materials that might exploit the weakness the possession had created. Instead, they assigned me to interrogation support, using my experience with possession to help identify others who'd been compromised, using my broken psychic sensitivity to detect corruption that normal psychers might miss, turning my damage into utility, making my scar productive. The Imperium wastes nothing, and a psyker who'd survived possession was too valuable to discard, too dangerous to ignore, so they put me to work in the space between, neither fully trusted nor fully condemned. The work is difficult in ways I struggle to articulate. When I examine a suspected psyker, when I reach out with what remains of my abilities to sense whether they've been touched by the warp, I feel it. The hollow space inside me resonates with similar hollows in others, recognizes the architecture of possession because I've been possessed, can identify the taste because I still taste it every moment of every day. I am good at this work, better than psychers with decades more experience, better than instruments designed to detect warp taint. But being good at it requires me to use the very damage that makes me suspect, requires me to lean into the wrongness, to let that hollow space expand slightly with each examination, with each touch of consciousness against someone else's corruption. I am changing, slowly but measurably. The psychers who monitor me and I am always monitored now. Every moment tracked, every action recorded have documented the progression. My psychic signature has developed harmonics it didn't possess before possession. My dreams, when I managed to achieve brief periods of sleep, contain imagery I didn't generate, thoughts that feel like memories of experiences I never had. The entity left fragments. Not itself, not consciousness or intention, just pieces, like shrapnel embedded too deep to extract without killing the patient. These fragments surface sometimes, usually during examinations, offering insights I couldn't have reached through my own knowledge. The entity had understood warp mechanics in ways humans can't, and some of that understanding remained, accessible in moments when I'm too tired or desperate to maintain the boundaries between what's mine and what it left behind. Interrogator Valence watches me with something that might be pity or might be clinical interest. She's the one who decides whether I remain useful or become too compromised to salvage. Every month, she conducts an evaluation, asks questions designed to reveal whether I've crossed whatever invisible line separates acceptable damage from unacceptable corruption. I answer honestly because lying would require energy I no longer possess, because the taste makes it hard to care about outcomes when every breath reminds me of what I've lost. She hasn't condemned me yet, hasn't ordered my execution or consignment to one of the detention levels where psychers too damaged for service spend their remaining days in monitored isolation. Instead, she keeps assigning me cases, keeps sending me to examine psychers who've exhibited symptoms, keeps using my brokenness to protect others from becoming similarly broken. There are others like me. Not many survival rates for possession are low enough that we're statistical anomalies, but enough that we've formed an informal community within the facility. We don't speak of it officially, don't gather or organize, but we recognize each other. In the corridors, during communal prayers, in the refectory where we take our meals, we recognize the taste, though each of us experiences it differently. Copper ash for me, rotting flowers for another, burning oil for a third. We recognize the way our psychic signatures have been altered, the way reality feels thinner around us, as if the exorcism didn't fully seal whatever gateway our possessions had opened. We are useful. We are dangerous. We are alive when we should be dead, and that survival has marked us in ways the Imperium understands but cannot fully accept. I have been surviving for 3 years. The taste has never faded. My sleep has never normalized. The hollow space inside me has not healed, will never heal, because healing requires the structure to regenerate, and the structure the entity destroyed wasn't flesh or bone but something more fundamental, some aspect of consciousness that defines the boundary between self and other, between the materium and the immaterium. I exist now in a state that isn't quite possession and isn't quite freedom, wearing my body like a coat that no longer fits properly, performing duties that require me to constantly touch the thing that destroyed me, to lean into corruption in service of identifying corruption in others. The Inquisition calls this useful. The ecclesiarchy calls it the Emperor's purpose. Survival granted so that my suffering might protect others from similar fates. I call it nothing because naming it requires energy I reserve for the work, for the constant effort of remaining functional when every moment reminds me of what I've become. I am not possessed. The entity is gone, cast back to the warp through rituals I barely survived, but I am not unpossessed either, not in the sense of being restored to what I was. I am something else, something in between. A space where something terrible once lived, now empty but forever shaped by that inhabitancy. They ask me sometimes, during evaluations, whether I regret surviving, whether I wish the exorcism had failed, had killed me, rather than leaving me in this state of permanent aftermath. I tell them I don't know, which is true. Regret requires comparison, requires believing an alternative outcome would have been preferable, but I no longer have access to the kind of certainty that makes such judgments possible. I exist. I serve. I taste copper and ash and nameless corruption with every breath. These are facts without value assignments. These are simply the conditions of my continued survival. The facility contains 17 other psychers who've survived possession. I've examined 14 of them in my capacity as interrogation support. Their damage patterns vary. Some lost the ability to shield their thoughts, broadcasting their consciousness constantly. Others developed inverted psychic sensitivity, able to detect warp phenomena, but unable to sense anything in normal reality. One woman lost her sense of linear time, experiences her life as a continuous present where past and future bleed together until she can barely distinguish memory from prophecy. We are all broken in unique ways. Each of us a case study in what survives when a human consciousness is forced to coexist with something that doesn't operate according to human rules, then violently separated from that thing. We are useful precisely because we're broken. Our damage is our qualification. Our survival is our sentence. I work 12-hour shifts examining suspected psychers, 20 to 30 examinations per week, each one requiring me to open my psychic senses, to extend my awareness into another person's consciousness, to feel for the telltale signs of warp taint that my hollow space can detect where normal sensitivities fail. Most examinations reveal nothing. The psychers are clean, their symptoms arising from stress or minor psychic instability, requiring counseling or meditation training but not exorcism or execution. But perhaps 1 in 50 shows signs of deeper corruption, contact with warp entities, attempted possession, the early stages of demonic influence. These cases I flag for interrogator valence, providing detailed reports about what I sensed, what the taint felt like, what patterns it formed in the target's consciousness. Then the strike teams deploy, the exorcists prepare, and another psyker faces the trial I've already survived, with odds heavily weighted against their survival. I've begun to recognize patterns across examinations. The taint leaves signatures, distinctive fingerprints that suggest different types of entities. Some possess with gradual subtlety, slowly replacing the host's consciousness until nothing original remains. Others crash in violently, overwhelming defenses through sheer force. Some seek specific knowledge or abilities, targeting psychers with particular talents. Others seem almost random, possessing whoever happens to be available when the gateway opens. The entity that possessed me belonged to the subtle category, had been working on me for months through that taste, that slow infiltration, building the foundation for possession long before I consciously noticed anything wrong. This knowledge doesn't comfort me, doesn't make the experience more bearable, but it makes me more effective at my work, more capable of identifying early-stage possessions before they progress to the point mine had reached. The taste intensifies during examinations. When I extend my psychic senses into someone else's consciousness, the copper ash nameless flavor explodes across my awareness, sometimes so overwhelming that I have to pause, have to physically step back and breathe through the nausea it produces. The facility's monitors have noted this, have documented how my physiological responses during examinations suggest significant distress, but they haven't intervened because I continue functioning, continue producing accurate assessments, continue being useful despite the obvious cost. The Imperium's calculus is simple. As long as I remain functional, as long as my damage serves a purpose, I will be used. When I break entirely, when the accumulated trauma makes me more liability than asset, I will be disposed of, with the same efficiency that governs all Imperial resource management. I met another survivor 3 months ago. Lexicanum Throne, though he no longer holds that rank officially, having been demoted to General Psyker status after his possession. His damage manifests differently than mine. He lost the ability to distinguish between his thoughts and external psychic noise, experiences the world as a constant psychic cacophony that makes basic conversation exhausting. We spoke briefly in the refectory, recognized each other not through words but through that mutual understanding that comes from shared trauma. He asked me if it gets better. I told him the truth. It doesn't get better or worse, just different. The damage becoming so familiar that you stop recognizing it as damage, start accepting it as your new baseline. He didn't seem comforted. I wasn't trying to comfort him. Comfort is a luxury for people who haven't had their consciousness invaded, who haven't felt what it's like to be a passenger in their own flesh. We who've survived don't trade in comfort. We trade in facts, in the cold acknowledgement of what we've become. The facility has protocols for psychers who've survived possession. Monthly psychological evaluations, weekly psychic examinations, daily observation through surveillance systems that monitor for any sign of recurring corruption. We're never truly trusted again, never fully restored to our previous status, regardless of how clean the exorcism was. The Inquisition operates on the principle that possession leaves permanent vulnerabilities, that whatever allowed the entity entry in the first place remains exploitable, that we're forever more susceptible to future possessions than psychers who've never been compromised. This principle isn't wrong. I can feel the hollow space inside me, can sense how reality is thinner around me, how the boundary between materium and immaterium remains damaged in ways that won't heal. If another entity wanted to possess me, it would find the work easier than the first one did. My defenses are compromised. My psychic architecture contains a doorway that was forced open and which the exorcism couldn't fully close. I think about the entity sometimes. Wonder where it went when the exorcism cast it back to the warp. Wonder if it remembers its 3 days wearing my flesh, if those memories mean anything to a being that exists outside linear time, that experiences reality as a shifting landscape of emotion and intention rather than fixed physical laws. The fragments it left behind suggest it experienced something like pleasure during the possession, something like satisfaction at the novelty of inhabiting a human body, accessing human sensations that don't exist in the warp. But these are interpretations filtered through my human consciousness, my need to assign familiar emotions to experiences that probably bear no relationship to anything I can comprehend. The entity wasn't human, wasn't evil or good or cruel or kind, was just other, operating according to rules I glimpsed but couldn't understand, using me for purposes I recognized only in fragments. Interrogator Valance asked me once whether I hated the entity, whether I blamed it for what happened to me, for the damage it caused, for the survival I'm enduring rather than living. I told her I didn't know how to hate something I couldn't fully comprehend, something that might not have even understood what it was doing to me in terms I'd recognize as deliberate harm. She found this answer unsatisfying, made notes suggesting possible emotional suppression or dissociation, but it was the truth. Hate requires understanding the target's intentions, requires believing they chose to harm you in ways they could have avoided. The entity didn't choose me specifically. I was available, was vulnerable, had accidentally invited it through my work with corrupted texts. It used me the way I might use a tool, without malice, without particular regard for my experience of being used. Hating it would be like hating a storm that destroyed your home. Pointless. The storm doesn't care. The entity didn't care. I was just a resource it accessed, then lost access to, moving on to whatever warp entities do when they're not wearing human flesh. The facility lost 3 psychers to possession last month. 2 were caught early, exorcised with standard protocols, died during the process. The 3rd wasn't caught early, wasn't caught at all until the entity had fully established itself, had begun using the psyker's body to corrupt others, spreading taint through psychic contact. The strike teams killed it along with its host, burned both to ash in sacred fires, scattered the remains according to protocols designed to prevent any possibility of recurrence. I examined the areas where the possessed psyker had operated, checked for residual corruption, found traces that suggested the entity had been preparing for a much larger operation, had been building towards something the strike teams interrupted. My report was filed, analyzed, resulted in increased security measures and additional surveillance of psykers who'd had contact with the deceased. Standard procedure, safe procedure. The machine of Imperial security grinding forward, processing threats, eliminating corrupted components, maintaining operational stability. I am a component now. Useful but suspect. Functional but damaged. Alive but not in any way that feels like living. Sleep having become rare and brief. Food having lost any appeal beyond nutritional necessity. Relationships having atrophied because connection requires energy I reserve for work and survival. I exist in a state of constant monitoring, constant evaluation, constant assessment of whether my continued function justifies the risk my survival represents. The Inquisition hasn't decided yet whether I'm more valuable alive or dead. Every monthly evaluation brings that decision closer, brings the moment when the balance might tip, when my accumulated damage might outweigh my utility. I don't fear this. Fear requires investment in future outcomes, requires believing that death is worse than continuation. I'm not certain anymore that this is true. Death would at least be definitive. An ending rather than this perpetual state of aftermath, this ongoing recovery from something you can't fully recover from. The taste remains. Copper and ash and nameless corruption. 3 years and it hasn't faded, hasn't diminished, remains as present as it was the morning I first noticed it, the warning I ignored until it was too late. I taste it now, writing this testimony in my chamber during a rare hour of personal time, taste it with every breath, every word formulated but not spoken. It's become so familiar that I barely notice it most days, have integrated it into my baseline perception the way you integrate chronic pain, learning to function through it rather than expecting it to ever fully resolve. This is what survival looks like after possession. Not victory or recovery or healing, but adaptation, learning to operate with damage that never repairs, learning to be useful despite or because of that damage. Learning to exist in the space between living and dying where the Imperium keeps people like me, using us until we break completely. They'll come for me eventually. The strike teams, the exorcists, the executioners, not because I'll become possessed again, though that's always possible, but because the accumulated trauma will eventually make me more unstable than useful, more likely to become a gateway than to help identify gateways in others. I've seen it happen to other survivors, watched them deteriorate over months or years until the Inquisition decided they'd crossed whatever threshold separated acceptable risk from unacceptable liability. Watched them disappear into detention levels or termination chambers, removed from service with the same bureaucratic efficiency that governs all Imperial resource management. I don't expect different treatment when my time comes. don't deserve it. I survived what I shouldn't have survived, and survival has marked me as permanently suspect, permanently compromised, permanently awaiting judgment that will eventually resolve in the only way such judgments can. Until then, I work. Examine psychers, identify corruption, use my brokenness to protect others from becoming similarly broken, taste copper and ash and nameless things with every breath, exist in this state of perpetual aftermath, this permanent recovery from something you can't recover from. This is what happens when you survive a full demonic possession in service to the Imperium. Not triumph, not blessing, just damage and duty, and the cold knowledge that your survival serves purposes beyond your comprehension, that you continue existing not because you're valued, but because you're useful, that when usefulness ends, so will you. The entity is gone. The hollow space remains. I am what's left, shaped by something that briefly inhabited me, forever defined by that encounter, surviving each day not toward healing but toward eventual termination. This is service. This is duty. This is what the Emperor's mercy looks like from the inside of a consciousness that something terrible once wore and which never quite fit right afterward. The taste remains. Always.